You're welcome to the Economy and Politics Conversation. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. This edition will discuss high inflation and monetary policy options for Nigeria. Joining me virtually for this conversation is Dr. Ogho Okiti, is the CEO of ThinkBusiness Africa. It's great to have you, Doctor, after a while.
Thank you so very much, Otto. It's always a pleasure to be with you here.
Yeah, we're discussing the state of the economy and taking the perspective from inflation. Of course, the latest figure, October 2024, shows that inflation continues to surge at 33.88%. That's the main inflation, while food inflation surged also to 39.16%. Food inflation is almost heading to 40%. And let us begin by looking at the drivers of inflation in Nigeria, which include food, energy and electricity costs, clothing, transportation, education, and health. These are basic things that citizens need and I need to address. Is this a cost push or demand pull situation from an economic perspective? And how does it impact households?
Thank you so very much for that question. Obviously, Nigeria's inflation is largely cost push. Of course, there are structural dimensions to it, but it's largely cost push. But I mean, you mentioned a lot of numbers that are up. I mean, sectors, you mentioned the food, you mentioned energy, electricity, and of course, you mentioned education and you mentioned health. But I think we should stay on two. There are two parameters driving the current trajectory of inflation, and that is food and energy. So those are the every other thing that you have seen, whether it's transport, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's services, every other form of inflation is feeding off these two parameters, food and fuel. In fact, you can call it F and F. So it's the food and inflation that we are experiencing in Nigeria today. It is cost push, it is structural, and there is so it's got nothing to do with demand at all, because as I believe you know, incomes are already extremely squeezed. So we are left with these two very important items that we have to buy, we have to purchase, because there are no alternatives to them. There's no substitute to food. There's no substitute to fuel in Nigeria today. So these are the two items driving inflation and driving the secondary inflation that you're actually referring to in other sectors.
Real. Food and fuel, very critical drivers which needs to be addressed. And ProShare also published its analyst note on the October 2024 inflation commentary, looking at the rising inflation and revealing inconvenient truths. It stated that 3/4 of domestic Nigerian inflation can be attributed to a declining exchange rate in its perspective, meaning that to bring down inflation, the monetary authorities need to raise the exchange value of the naira. Now, this has been part of what some monetary economists like Dr. Ogho have talked about too. So what should be the approach in this area? Because we really need to deepen our foreign exchange. We've talked about now almost heading to $40 billion reign of foreign reserves. We need a lot of foreign exchange. Is it not important that we begin to look at financializing our national assets? Is that not a low-hanging fruit which we have the Ministry of Finance Incorporated set up for? What needs to be done at this time?
Well, I mean, I get asked these questions all the time, and I will provide the answer that I always give. So you have to kind of look at the context of where we are. We have two very important economic problems. Two, there are more than two, but there are two important economic problems. One is high inflation, and the other is the severe weakness in the naira relative to other foreign currencies, or relative to foreign currencies, whether it's the USD or the sterling, or of course the euro and every other currency. So the naira has been very weak for over 18 months now. In that period as well, we have experienced severe volatility. So not only was the naira weak, the naira was also very volatile.
Yeah.
So you're asking me what needs to be done. I think I will try and break it down a bit here. The challenge I think we have not been able, or let me say the argument, the debate in which we have not settled is that what is the source of this volatility?
Mm.
What is the
Very good.
source of the pressure on on the Naira? Because
Mm.
if you
Yeah.
look at the dimensions, if you look at the import and export, that's looking at trade in Nigeria since 2010, it will surprise you that the level of import has remained relatively stable even from 2010. However, our exports have not. And we know what has happened to our export. Our export, we are talking about crude oil, has declined by about 50% since that time.
Yeah.
So now we have less receipt, foreign exchange receipt compared to. So, of course, you also know what happens when we have a declining foreign exchange rate. It also means that we have fiscal crisis because we have fiscal, because our crude oil receipts translate to fiscal revenues and receipts,
Yeah.
and that fiscal revenues and receipts translate to other things in the economy. So it means that if we have a decline in fiscal receipt, it means that the first point of impact is fiscal revenue. So the question then is this, okay, if you are in government and you're in fiscal policy and you have a declining revenue, what is the reason why you have that declining revenue? You should address that. And I am happy that the present government is now trying to address the crude oil production. But let's leave that because that will come in the medium term, of course, towards the long term. But in the immediate crisis, what is it that the government has done? What the government has done is that they have not borrowed temporarily to adjust. They have made the increase in deficit and debt a permanent revenue source. That is the problem.
Yeah.
That is the problem. So let me try and explain how bad that is. So if I am Ogho Okiti and I was earning 5 million naira as a staff sometime 6 months ago, as a staff in ProShare, for instance, and I was earning 5 million naira 6 months ago, and due to the economic crisis, ProShare let me go. So I'm asking myself, and I'm asking you, and I'm asking my viewers, would my response be that the month after, I continue to live as if I still earn 5 million a month? The answer is no, because if I continue in that trajectory, I'm doing two things. I'm either spending my savings or I am borrowing. Now, because the government did not have savings, they have already exhausted that. They have now moved to the trajectory of borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing in order to keep up with the level of expenditure. So as individuals and businesses, I'm asking the same question because we all face the same budget constraints. As individuals and businesses, within 6 months, I will go bankrupt because one, I will not be able to call friends again to support me. I will not be able to call my bank to support me. I will not be able to call maybe my church or my mosque to support me. So it means that in the medium term, I must find a way to adjust to my new reality. However, not Nigerian government. Not Nigerian government. So whether it's 2015, whether it's 2020, whether it's 2024, Nigerian government successfully cannot raise their revenue. However, they find it very easy to just continue to borrow and borrow and borrow and borrow. And that is the source of the pressure. That is why we are in this mess. And until there is a containment of the penchant, ridiculous appetite for just borrowing, and we have no solution. So let me try and tell you two implications, especially for your audience here. Two implications. So deficit and debt that I already told you that, oh, inflation is from two sources. So you have food and of course you have fuel. Okay, that's fine, no problem. However, it does not end there. If I don't tell you that, why is the fuel a big problem? The fuel one is a big problem because of the exchange rate weakness. So what is causing the exchange rate weakness is this piling up of debts and deficits. So if you actually go back to the root of the inflation, which I have just explained to you, you are going back to fiscal policy, expenditure, fiscal policy and expenditure. That is where the problem of Nigeria is.
Yeah, very
and
clearly.
The second implication is this. Because of inflation, one, our incomes are being squeezed because obviously everyone is experiencing declining income. If you are in government, no problem, because government is government. So government is nobody's problem. Government is nobody. So anybody in government will just keep piling on the problem and of course sorting out themselves. You know what I mean? So that is that if you're in government. If you are not in government, like me and you, and they are piling on, they are causing this high inflation through deficit and debt, it means that our incomes are squeezed. That's number one. However, it doesn't stop that. The exchange rate weakness, which I have also told you where the pressure is coming from, it means that not only is income, real income declining, it means that our relative wealth is also declining. So if your property is worth about 500 million or 300 million sometime last year, and of course, that same property, maybe that last year is worth about 150,000 US dollars or 200,000 US dollars. That property is now worth much, much, much less than that. And do you know the implication of that again? Let me bring in the third issue. It means that the foreign direct investment that you want to attract, it means that you cannot attract it. Right? Because anyone that wants to bring in $1 million to Nigeria today, the $1 million is $1 million. But the moment you convert that $1 million into Naira, that value starts to decline even before you have carried out the investment. So we are in a serious, serious crisis. And let me make it worse. Let me make it worse for you. We now have the same government, they are proposing a whopping 48 trillion for 2025 budget, bearing in mind that in the first 6 months of this year, deficit actually reached 7.5% of GDP. So what usually happens is that this government and the government before it and the government before that, they have never been able to provide realistic budget estimates. So when they are not able to do that and they are not able to get all the revenue that they require, what happens is that they go and borrow more. Why? They cannot control expenditure, but they have unbelievable appetite for deficit and debt. It's a serious problem.
Very serious challenge, Doctor, and at least it's a very fundamental thing that needs to be really addressed. And of course, like you rightly said, there have been several views. We can't continue like this. Nigerian Economic Society has talked about it, and various other advocacy policy groups. Nigerian Economic Summit Group 2 has talked for that need for alignment of fiscal, trade, and even social investment policies, because borrowing and all that is not sustainable. And like I articulated, financialization of our assets, value from assets needs to be put on the front burner to address this issue of assessing revenue, boosting our foreign exchange, and then crude oil production too has been a major way for which we've been growing. But we have to diversify the economy, but most importantly, diversify the revenue sources. But Doctor, you've laid a very huge.
Otto, let me just say, I don't want to leave your audience hanging here. When you talk about financialization, I agree and I understand that. I understand the argument. And I mean, we both know that the person that has made the most argument has been Dr. Chariba on this matter. And I agree. However, the assumption behind that is that revenue is the problem.
Yeah.
Revenue is not the problem. The reason you don't have greater level of revenues is because you have not spent the ones that you have on generating further revenues. So let me give you an example. In US dollar terms, between 2015 and 2024, we have had 44% increase in national debt in US dollar terms. Okay.
That's huge.
However, in Naira terms is 1,000%. But in the same period, economic growth averages 2% annually. Meanwhile, if you ask any government official, why do you borrow? They will say they are borrowing in order to spur economic growth. So if we are really borrowing to generate economic growth, why do we have so much divergence?
That's a huge conversation. And
So
Doctor, that's a very major point. Yeah.
Why do we have that divergence? So it means that our debts are not being used for any kind of productive activity.
Productivity,
so
very key word there.
Selling assets or securitization assets or financialization of assets, they are all great initiative, all these wonderful buzzwords. They are all very, very important. However, if you don't deal with the way government spends money in Nigeria, then we cannot deal with macroeconomic instability. And if we don't deal with macroeconomic instability, we cannot deal with growth.
I'll leave it there, Doctor. That's a very core point you raised there. Let's look at the monetary policy side now. The Pro-Share article has analyzed that it is not a competent tool for tightening monetary policy. And we know that at this point, we have the monetary policy meeting in place today and tomorrow. What is your perspective on this? The MPR, not an effective tool for tightening monetary policy.
Okay. So we're going back to the same thing. Why did the Central Bank of Nigeria needed to raise rates? It needed to raise rates in order to contain inflation. And why do we have so high inflation? We have already gone past that. I've already stretched that argument now. So you needed to raise rates in order to contain inflation. However, we also know that that is not going to work 100%. However, in the narrow purpose for attracting at least some form of portfolio flows, it has actually worked. So because between February and I think it was last month, analysis showed that the central bank has been, through raise in interest rate, has been able to attract an estimated $8 billion. That is fantastic.
So as we wrap up, the article from Pro-Share also explained why expansionary fiscal policy does not align with tightened monetary policy, suggesting an asymmetry in economic governance. As we expect the decision day tomorrow, what is the way forward? This approach of raising rates to tackle inflation and all that, but most importantly, the asymmetry in economic governance. How can we achieve this with all that you've raised today?
That's the point we are having now, because they have raised the rate, but we still have the challenge. The only positive thing is that by raising the rate, we have been able to attract, maybe you can say not so significant, but at least substantial foreign portfolio inflows, which I shared earlier. So we have been successful in that respect. However, further success will require that fiscal policy takes the lead by dealing with deficits and dealing with debt. That is very, very important. Otherwise, even if we have another 50 basis points raise tomorrow, we'll find out that the strong response to the rate in February, April, and like that we had, we can't continue to have that kind of response because monetary policy has gone as far as it's required to do. we need to go back to the source of the problem. The source of the problem is fiscal policy and fiscal expenditure.
So in very clear terms,
this year, we are talking about almost 30 trillion. And bear in mind that in addition to that, or because of that, we had a significant transfer of resources from the private sector to the public sector through the removal of fuel subsidy. But remember the argument before the removal of subsidy, which was to deal with deficit and debt, to deal with education, to deal with health, and to deal with infrastructure. So the question then is, 18 months after the removal of subsidy, federal and state government, what has happened to those 4 items? Debt and deficit, education expenditure, health expenditure, infrastructure expenditure, nothing significant. So we will continue to be on this trajectory if we don't get a grip on fiscal policy and expenditure.
Yeah, very important point. And this is critical for fiscal policy. They must take the lead. They must address issues of fiscal debt, the deficits, and the issue of debt. And we must begin to spend on what is productive and unlock our economy. We can't continue in this trajectory as you raised, and we trust that the fiscal authorities, as we prepare to see the presentation of the 2025 budget, will take all of these issues into consideration. Not just you, Dr. Ogho Okiti, but several economists and advocacy groups have raised their concerns on fiscal policy approach at this time, critical time. Thank you once again, Dr. Ogho Okiti, the CEO of ThinkBusiness Africa, an economist, and also you've also had your own role in advising governments in past years. So we'll leave that, but some other time we'll talk about that. But thank you very much for taking out your time to have this conversation on the high inflation
Thank you so
and
much.
policy options for Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes. To our viewers, if you want to get further insights on this conversation, visit the ProShare website displayed on the screen and follow our social media platforms to engage further on this program. Until we come your way again, enrich yourself with knowledge of socioeconomic developments around you. It is why. Ottoabasi Abasiekong, thank you for watching, and bye for now.